שירו לאדוני, שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני, כל הארץ, שירו לאדוני, ברכו שמו, בסחו מיום ליום ישועתו. שירו לאדוני שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני כל הארץ, שירו לאדוני ברכו שמו, בסחו מיום ליום ישועתו. ספרו בגויים כבודו, לכל העמים נפלאותיו, כי גדול אדוני ומהולל מאוד, נורא הוא על כל אלוהים. שירו לאדוני שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני כל הארץ, שירו לאדוני ברכו שמו, בסחו מיום ליום ישועתו. ספרו בגויים כבודו, לכל העמים נפלאותיו, כי גדול אדוני ומהולל מאוד, נורא הוא על כל אלוהים. שירו לאדוני שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני כל הארץ, שירו לאדוני ברכו שמו, בסחו מיום ליום ישועתו. ספרו בגויים כבודו, לכל העמים נפלאותיו, כי גדול אדוני ומהולל מאוד, נורא הוא על כל אלוהים. שיר לאדוני, שיר לאדוני, שיר לאדוני. ספרו בגויים כבודו, לכל העמים נפלאותיו, כי גדול אדוני ומהולל מאוד, נורא הוא על כל אלוהים. שירו לאדוני שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני כל הארץ, שירו לאדוני ברכו שמו, בסחו מיום ליום ישועתו. שירו לאדוני, שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני, כל הארץ, שירו לאדוני, ברכו שמו, בסחו מיום ליום ישועתו. שירו לאדוני שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני כל הארץ, שירו לאדוני.
Good afternoon, everybody. So glad that you are here with us for our annual symposium. I'm going to invite you to take your seats. And whether this is your first time at this program, or I don't want to say your 100th time, I don't know, maybe I don't know if we've been doing this for 150 years, but let's say your 20th time. It is always amazing to hear the stories and the perspectives of the members of our community. I always finish this hour learning more about the people, more about what our community is like, and really what all the many different ways that Judaism inspires our lives. This year we have 4 wonderful people who are going to share, as we always have wonderful people. We have Jeff Goldblatt, Marcia Krasner, Jeff Wurzburg, and Samantha Wohler. And of course, we are delighted to have Agarita here with us again this year, sharing beautiful music as a mode for contemplation between each speaker. So with that, I'll invite up Jeff and we'll get started.
Santa Claus, good old jolly Saint Nick. My earliest memory of my Jewish journey starts with the jolly guy in the big red suit. Let's just say the earliest years of my Jewish journey were very conflicted for a Jewish kid. Yes, we celebrated Hanukkah, we spun dreidels, and we even got a present every night of the Festival of Lights, but we also sat on Santa's lap at the mall, left milk and cookies for Santa, and had Christmas stockings hanging from the fireplace. My parents, they just wanted the best for their children. They wanted us to feel included and to give us a sense of belonging. They weren't raised in homes where Judaism was worshipped. They didn't know any better. Even though we were living in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., where there were enough Jews that public schools were closed during the high holidays. Fast forward a few years, my parents decided to join a temple. Mind you, the congregation didn't have its own synagogue, so we actually attended Sunday school at a place by the name of Connolly School of the Holy Child. I have 3 vivid memories of my Sunday school days. Number 1 was dread. Number 2 was all the nuns who used to walk around campus. And number 3, those big wooden crucifixes that were on the walls. I used to marvel at the muscles of Jesus' arms as an alternative to paying attention to my Jewish studies. Now, I did have a bar mitzvah, but we had it in the basement of my home, of my family. I don't remember much about my coming of age ceremony. I don't remember my Torah portion, my Haftorah portion. Heck, about the only thing that I remember was the white suit that my mother put me in. But keep in mind, this was the early 80s. Looking back, this was a time of religious incongruity in my life. In the eyes of Judaism, I had fulfilled my obligations of my bar mitzvah and was now a full-fledged member of the Jewish community and ready to tackle the responsibilities that came with it. On the other hand, I didn't understand my religion. I knew little about the history of Jews, our belief system, and our customs, and I quickly forgot how to read Hebrew. Still to this day, I hum through much of the service here at Beth-El. Yes, I'm good with the Shema, but with all the other stuff, I'm often supremely lost. It probably won't surprise you that with several notable exceptions, I had 20 years of my life defined by Jewish apathy. From my bar mitzvah extending 2 decades into my 30s, my Jewish light, if you will, was barely flickering. I went to college where Jews were a significant minority. My first jobs out of college were in cities in the South where there was either no synagogue or there was a very small presence of Jews. I mean, how was I going to explain to my boss as a kid in my 20s that I needed a day off for a religious holiday that wasn't Christmas? So I barely ever went to a synagogue during these 2 decades of my life, even for high holidays. The trajectory of my Jewish journey started to change when I met the love of my life, my wife, Lori, back there, who was raised in a household where Judaism wasn't just practiced, but where religion was understood. We were married by a rabbi, married under a chuppah, ketubah sign, glass smash, the whole schmear. We started our Jewish household in the Chicago suburbs, and I regularly attended high holiday services with her parents. We had 4 children born in Chicago, 2 boys and 2 girls, all of them having formal Jewish ceremonies to mark their births. We lived in a community where Judaism was prevalent. Unlike here in San Antonio, the business world in Chicago stopped on Yom Kippur, stores closed down, and clients knew they would not get a phone call or a text return until after the end of our holy day. All that said, I probably took my religion for granted until 3 defining events happened during my professional career. One of them, meeting the head of the Ku Klux Klan. But I'm going to get to that in a minute. I just want to tease you to make sure you're staying awake without any food in your bellies. If you didn't get a chance to read the bios of the speakers here on the dais, for 9 years, or I should say the Bema in this case, for 9 years I was a national correspondent with the Fox News Channel, based out of Chicago. I would travel the country and the world reporting on the most significant news of the day. The Second Intifada started in the fall of 2000. This was a major Palestinian uprising in Israel, marked by Palestinian suicide bombings targeting Israeli citizens, and Israeli tank and aerial military action in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Rough data estimates that the violence led to the deaths of 1,000 Israelis and 3,000 Palestinians. I was sent by Fox News to the front lines of this conflict, sent to Ramallah in the West Bank, a Jewish journalist in a hostile hot zone. I didn't go anywhere without a bulletproof vest. I tried to report on the conflict without bias, despite my religion. I will never forget walking into the wreckage of the compound of PLO leader Yasser Arafat in June of 2002. Israeli tanks had demolished everything in response to a Palestinian bus bombing that killed 17 Israelis. Israeli Foreign Minister at the time, Shimon Peres, said the assault had been designed to impress upon Mr. Arafat that Israel held him accountable for the wave of suicide attacks inside the Jewish state. There was smashed glass and crumbled concrete everywhere. And I remember touching these tattered curtains and seeing a hole in the wall of what was once Yasser Arafat's bedroom, and seeing specks of blood on the floor, splattered indiscriminately, perhaps coming from one of Arafat's guards who was killed during the assault. I felt very vulnerable at that moment, but also very Jewish. Don't get me wrong, I am not a warmonger. I do not support bloodshed. But it is a raw and indescribable feeling to be at the epicenter of a world where people want you dead just because of your religion. It's a feeling that returned in 2006 in Israel when I was sent to the front lines of the Second Lebanon War. I was posted by Fox News in northern Israel in Kiryat Shimona for this 34-day military conflict, which was marked by indiscriminate Hezbollah rocket attacks on Israeli settlements. I lost track of the number of Katyusha rockets I counted slamming into the Israeli foothills. We were so close to the action that at night, I kid you not, the only way to get any sleep was to drink a couple of glasses of wine, pop an Ambien, put on my Bose headphones, and pray to God that the rockets and the Israeli counterfire wouldn't slam into my hotel room. Every day felt like my own version of Russian roulette. Would I make it to see the sunset? How about the sunrise? Would I make it home alive? And I almost didn't. One day while on air, the lancing thunder of a Katyusha rocket clapped with intense ferocity. I dove to the ground as quickly as possible, as if that was going to save my life. As I looked up, I saw a tree on fire about 100 yards away. 100 yards were all that separated me from death. When the air raid siren stopped, I scurried over to that tree and I had to see for myself what was out there. And this was about all that was left. A piece of violently twisted metal, hot to the touch, charred by the blast, fired by Hezbollah. I keep this as a reminder of my Jewish roots, and I'll occasionally pull it out and run my fingers over it just to think and to reflect. And now that story about meeting the head of the KKK, Thomas Robb. I got the assignment because the KKK was trying to adopt a highway near St. Louis. The story took me to, of all places, the Ozarks. Many of you might be familiar now with the Ozarks and how backwards they are because of that TV show. I went to Harrison, Arkansas to be exact, but way back up in the hills. And I remember pulling onto that property and saying to my videographer, "Is that what I think it is over there?" And sure enough, it was a burnt cross Over the next hour, I sat there and I interviewed the national director of the KKK, who had been leading the hate group for decades. My mindset was, if you don't take the risk of staring hate head on, how are you going to even try and understand it? It turned out to be a fascinating conversation. We covered a lot of ground. Mr. Rob actually came off as amiable, somewhat even likable. But the undercurrent of hate had me on edge. I couldn't wait to get the heck out of there. But not before Mr. Rob told me on the way out the door that he enjoyed the conversation so much that there was a place for me in the Klan that if I had ever thought about consider joining. In this case, I did not stop and tell him I was Jewish. There would be other times in my life to flex my Jewish muscles, but this was not the right place. Now I want to fast forward to 2012. That's when I decided to accept a job here in San Antonio as main anchor of Ken's 5. I remember being very concerned about finding a Jewish home here. I was worried about anti-Semitism in Texas. When Lori and I came for our house hunting trip, one of the first places we stopped was Beth-El. We felt immediately at home in this historic, beautiful building, and learning about our congregation during a meeting with Jerry Gregory, and we joined on the spot. Judaism in San Antonio, it is wonderful, but let's just say it's an interesting experience. When we moved here, one of the first questions we would get often is, where's your church? We would say with pride, we are Jewish. We're at Temple Beth-El. I had all kinds of conversations with Christians confused that we don't celebrate Christmas, that we don't see Jesus the same way they do, and that we do not believe in the second coming. Yes, we're an extreme minority in San Antonio, but I've also never felt as close to my religion as I do now. Our four children had their bar and bat mitzvahs right here on this bima. I'd never lifted Torah in a synagogue until Beth-El. I'd never delivered Devar Torah until Beth-El. I'd never been on a bima leading a synagogue until Beth-El. I had never attended a Shabbat service until Beth-El. I am very thankful for Beth-El, and I feel closer to God than ever when I'm here. I served on the board of Beth-El for 6 years. I'm currently one of the vice presidents of Brotherhood. And although I'm not at services as much as I used to be, I know I have a home here and that we're trying to do our part as a Jewish family to speak up about our religion. One day, I would like to read Hebrew, to learn about it more, and to take a trip to Israel without any bloodshed. But until then, my Jewish light bulb is kept on by this congregation, but also as board chair of Jewish Family Service, which is one of the most prolific nonprofit providers in San Antonio of mental health services to people of all incomes and all religions. And we have a mission there of Tikkun Olam about leaving the world a better place than we found it. During this day of forgiveness, I know God long ago forgave me for leaving milk and cookies for Santa. I've certainly forgiven my parents, and certainly I've forgiven myself. Through all the twists of my journey, I know my heart is Jewish. Despite living in a world where people want the worst for me because of my religion, I will continue to teach my children about Jewish values, of tolerance and selflessness, and love, and taking a stand against hate. May you all have an easy and a meaningful fast.
It was 1982 on Yom Kippur, and I was driving down Columbia Road in Washington, D.C. with my then boyfriend, David, our car overflowing with boxes, moving into an apartment together for the first time. Obviously, a huge decision, and I might add the right one, since we will be celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary next year. Sometime during the day, moving and unpacking boxes and taking the occasional break, I turned to David and I said, "Oh my God, it's Yom Kippur. If my mother knew what I was doing, she'd kill me." That it was Yom Kippur, the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar, and that it had slipped my mind was really unthinkable. I felt ashamed. You see, I was raised in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood and in a traditional Jewish home. My childhood was marked by the weekly rhythm of celebrating Shabbat and the holidays that punctuated each season. On Friday nights, Barb and I would rush to the calendar hanging on a magnet by the refrigerator and shout, "Mommy, calendar, candle lighting is at 5:52. We only have 3 minutes." We'd set up the candles, and one of us would strike the match, and together we'd sing the blessings. Christmas was just a day off for us, and like Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, our family could be found at the local Chinese restaurant on Christmas Eve. Our celebrations were Jewish holidays, beginning in the fall with Rosh Hashanah, moving into Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot, which we usually spent in my Bubby and Zadie's sukkah, and from which we hung fruit, not plastic fruit, but pungent grapes, bright red and green apples, and oranges and lemons, the air filled with the aroma of citrus. Next up was Hanukkah, with Bubby and Zadie talking in Yiddish off by themselves while the cousins played dreidel and waited until we could get to the table and stuff ourselves with latkes and brisket. How did my mother and my Aunt Phyllis make latkes for so many people and without an electric blender? Surely there were drops of blood in the mixture from grating the potatoes and onions by hand. My mother's eyes would water and her cheeks would become 2 bright pink circles standing over the frying pan. Winter turned to spring, which brought Passover, always at Bubby and Zadie's house before they passed away. We used the legendary blue and white covered Maxwell House Haggadah, and after the 4 questions were recited and the main meal was served, the kinder, as we were called in Yiddish, played under the large dining room table, while my Zadie read every single word of the rest of the Haggadah in Hebrew, no skipping parts for him. Truly, the Seder was interminable until we were allowed to run around to find the afikomen and eat kosher for Passover chocolate-covered jelly rings. By the time dessert was finished, the noise level had risen to a fevered pitch as Zadie and Uncle George sang all the verses of every song. I especially remember Chag Gadya as they pounded their fists on the table. Our Seders in those years were exhilarating and exhausting. I attended Hebrew school 3 days a week. My main memories were celebrating Israel's military exploits and the brilliance of Moshe Dayan. This was after the 6-Day War, learning Hebrew and collecting money in a blue tin box for planting trees in Israel. In 1969, I was in the first class of girls at my synagogue to have a bat mitzvah, although we were relegated to the Friday night service and were only allowed to read the Haftorah. Oh, and did I mention that I was raised in a strictly kosher home? My parents were financially limited means, but not a dollar was spared as it pertained to our massive collection of kitchenware. We had everyday dairy and meat dishes, and dairy and meat silverware, and dairy and meat pots and pans. We had beautiful china and silverware, also meat and dairy, that were brought out on all the holidays. And we had Passover dishes, meat and dairy, of course, together with the attendant silverware and pots and pans. I mustn't fail to tell you that I grew up in a small 2-bedroom apartment in New York City. Barbara and I shared a bedroom. My parents had their bedroom. We had a single bathroom, a small kitchen, a dining room, and a living room, and very, very few closets. It seemed like any time we opened a closet, another box of dishes or pots and pans would tumble out, and we would have to be stuffed back in while we quickly shut the door. And of course, there were the weekly visits to the kosher butcher, a small shop with sawdust on the floor, and Kenny standing behind the counter wearing his blood-stained apron. And there were trips to Wexler's, which we then called an appetizing store. I don't even know that they exist anymore. That sold pickles in large barrels, whitefish, kibbered herring, lox and bagels, and those chocolate-covered jellies. This was my life until I left home. So rich, so ordered, lighting the Shabbat candles, and each season bringing another holiday. There was no talk of Jewish history or the Holocaust, no Torah study, no philosophical questions to mull over, just the comfortable rhythms and predictability of the Jewish cycle of life. So, how was it at age 26 that I find myself schlepping boxes from David's house and my house to our first apartment together on the holiest day of the Jewish year? Where did I take a wrong turn? And how did I get here today, 41 years later, on this bima, after that fateful Yom Kippur? Actually, I'm not sure that I really took a wrong turn. Rather, my Jewish identity just receded as I left home, and home, as I knew it, changed. Bubby and Zadie died, extended family dispersed, and my parents moved to Florida and ultimately passed away there. A common story. But there were so many moments in the years that followed that Yom Kippur, 1982, that were pivotal to bringing me to the place on the bima that I'm standing today. Too many to recount in only 10 minutes, so I'll just mention a few. I married David, who wasn't Jewish, and suddenly it became critical that we should be married by a rabbi. We searched and we searched for a rabbi in the DC area that would marry us, an interfaith couple, and finally found the Jewish chaplain at Georgetown University. 8 years later, Benjamin was born. When he was 9 months old, my mother-in-law came to visit in December. By that time, we were living in Austin. I always loved Christmas, from a distance, that is. And when David told me that his mother would visit, it was clear that she was coming for Christmas. So, we went to a Christmas lot, we bought a tree, got a few ornaments, and there it stood in our living room, like an alien spaceship, and with me cautiously walking around it. I couldn't wait until it was okay to put it out on the curb and be picked up by the garbage truck, truly. I'm sorry, but that's how I felt. I had an epiphany afterwards, truly. I recalled a friend in grade school. Her father was Jewish and her mother was not. It was very common in those days, in that generation, to ask your friends, what are you? And people would answer, oh, I'm Jewish, I'm Catholic, whatever. When I asked this friend, she said, I'm nothing. That answer stayed with me for decades. So, right after what we now fondly refer to as the Christmas tree incident, I sat down with David and told him that I couldn't face the thought that our kids might give the same answer, and I was determined to raise them as Jews. We'd never discussed it before, and lucky for me, David had no doubts or qualms. He loved the Jewish traditions. His intellectual heroes and influences were all Jewish, and our closest friends were Jewish. So there we were, on our way to creating our own Jewish home. Nellie was born 3 years later. The four of us moved to San Antonio. We joined Temple and enrolled them in religious school, and each had a bar bat mitzvah. By that time, my parents had passed away, so those events were, at the same time, incredibly joyous and really unbelievably sad. We wrote our own Haggadah for Passover. We lit candles on Friday nights. We ate challah and bagels. We made brisket and latkes. We built a Jewish community. We didn't replicate my childhood. It wasn't possible, but we raised 2 children who identify as Jews. And finally, along the way, somewhere, I learned for the first time in my adult life the words Tikkun Olam. As I told you earlier, I grew up culturally Jewish, but completely, I mean completely, ignorant of Judaism as a religion. But when I heard those words, repairing the world, It clicked. At that moment, I had a calling of what it means to me to be Jewish. Tikkun Olam gave me a context, an identity, a descriptor for who I was, for who I am now, for how I've lived my working life, and how I spend my personal time. All the marches and rallies for social justice I've attended, the organizations I've joined and participated in, the clients I've worked with in poor communities in my field, the money I donate to Temple and to causes that I passionately believe in, it all just clicked once I understood this fundamental Jewish concept. In short, those two words, I discovered myself. I realized that the purpose of a Jewish life is to help right the wrongs, to leave the world a better place than the one I entered, to do the good deeds, to become the best person I can be. Frankly, it wasn't at all about finding God, although it was and is about a belief system that treasures social justice above all, that embraces the stranger, that believes in forgiveness in others and in ourselves. I'd like to close with a short quote that I discovered in the Mishkan Halev that we read during the month of Elul by Martin Buber. God does not want to be believed in, to be debated, and to be defended by us, but simply to be realized through us. Thank you.
Recently, I had the pleasure of being reacquainted with one of my favorite and wisest Jewish scholars, Adam Sandler. In his new movie, You're So Not Invited to My Bat Mitzvah, He plays the father to his real-life daughters. The youngest is preparing for her bat mitzvah. Now there's a pivotal scene in the movie where Adam Sandler's character is upset with his daughter's behavior at religious school, and he says to her, "Every time you walk into that synagogue, you are declaring to everyone and to God, I'm Jewish, and I'm a part of this." That declaration really resonated with me. That is how I feel about my own Jewishness. Now, in the spirit of Yom Kippur, I will acknowledge I am not the most pious of Jews. In fact, when I got Rabbi Jurgen's email, I thought it was a mistake, like those texts you get asking if your parents want to sell their house. But as I recently read while preparing for this speech, Jewishness is more a matter of pride than practice for me. Sure, I attend the high holidays. We celebrate the holidays with our family, but I don't consider myself religious. I think the last time I wore a tallis was actually at my bar mitzvah. But it's not lost on me that Brett and I were wrapped in her grandfather's tallis under our wedding chuppah. Throughout my life, I've often felt more comfortable as an ambassador of our faith than as a practitioner of it. For example, I attended Indiana University, proudly. Indiana has wonderful Jewish fraternities, and yet I chose the one with a giant white cross on the sign in the yard out front. I have a wonderful picture with my mom Ruth in front of that sign. But traveling abroad, my distinctly not Jewish fraternity brothers were the ones who encouraged me and supported me and came with me to the old synagogues and the graveyard, the Jewish cemetery in Prague. Years later, these same fraternity brothers wore yarmulkes, watched YouTube to learn how to dance the hora, could not wait to throw Brett and me up in chairs, and in fact offered to buy us helmets and had a wonderful time at our wedding. So despite coming from different backgrounds, distinct traditions, they embraced me. They supported my Jewishness and my traditions. So as I spent the last couple of months thinking about Rabbi Jurgen's request, I came to think about my Judaism and how it impacts me a little differently. How many of my most cherished memories involve my faith and my identity as a Jew. The cherished memories of Jewish holidays. I spent eating matzo ball soup, kugel, brisket, sitting around the table with family and friends, talking, sharing stories about our lives. The shared events like my bar mitzvah and our wedding. I may not consider myself religious, but I proudly identify as a Jew. And I even consider myself extremely Jewish because I purposely weave my family's traditions into our life and into our young family. Because as Sandler so poignantly said, I'm Jewish, I'm a part of this. My grandmother, Alice, was a Holocaust survivor. I recently came across her handwritten notes about her story, and they began like this. My brother and I were the only survivors of our family. Our parents, 2 grandparents, 3 aunts, 1 uncle, and a number of cousins were murdered in the concentration camps. Alice was born in Czechoslovakia. In 1942, her parents sent her and her brother Oscar to Hungary, where they remained in hiding. While in hiding, Oscar became a bar mitzvah age, and so, in the middle of the night, Alice snuck him out so that he could become a bar mitzvah. She gave him a silver ring with his initials on it. For my bar mitzvah, and the bar and bat mitzvahs of my cousins, we also received a silver initial ring, just like his, and Alice and Oscar shared their story. In just a few years, we will do the same for Jake and Reed, because we're Jewish, and we're a part of this. Alice and Oscar were eventually given up to the Nazis and transported to the concentration camps, in cattle cars. Now, unlike the rest of their family, they survived. They went on to have meaningful and rich lives. Alice even went on to translate for the Red Cross during the Nuremberg trials. With the help of an uncle in Dallas, They eventually were reunited, and they immigrated here to the United States. In fact, Oscar settled here in San Antonio, became a prominent businessman, was a member of this synagogue. I'd like to think that he's very proud. He would be very proud knowing that today my children run around the same halls that his children did, that his niece, my mother Ruthie, attends services here, attends meetings here, because we're Jewish and we're a part of this. So, 47 years after their arrival in the United States, on April 22nd, 1993, Alice was at the dedication of the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. She heard President Clinton reflect that we must all now frankly admit that there will come a time in the not too distant future when the Holocaust will pass from living reality and shared experience to memory and history. That time has arrived. And today, that obligation is on my generation and the descendants of survivors to ensure that we never forget. I am grateful that later in her life, Alice began to share her story. She spoke at schools, including mine, and she recorded her story for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. By doing so, generations to come will bear witness to the Holocaust indirectly. And my children will one day see their great-grandmother's face, hear her voice, and know that they too are the descendants of a survivor. Alice's experience also drove me to be involved with the Anti-Defamation League when we lived in Washington, D.C. I served on the regional board. I also met my wife through the ADL. So, in some ways, I have my grandmother to thank for the family that I have today, as her story and her memory lives on through us. Together, Brett and I feel a duty to carry on the traditions that we grew up with and that were sought to be eradicated during the Holocaust because we're Jewish and we're a part of this. Now, on my father's side, his family immigrated from Germany in the 1800s. They were involved with the establishment of the Reform movement in Chicago. Together, my father, Dick, my mother, Ruth, my grandparents ensured that my brother and I, Rob, grew up celebrating Jewish holidays. We attended Sunday school. We were bar mitzvahs. And they instilled in us a great sense of tikkun olam. My grandparents relocated a Torah that made it through the Holocaust to Joliet, Illinois. In retirement, my grandfather, Sam Goldhaber, started the Will Grundy Medical Clinic, which to this day provides free healthcare services to people in Will and Grundy counties in Illinois. If you're ever driving through Joliet, aside from going to Marishka's and having a poor boy, I'm sorry to mention food, you can drive down Goldhaber Lane, which was named after my grandfather based on what he did in his own community. My grandmother, Babette, tutored Spanish-speaking immigrants. When I was in elementary school, I recall acutely going to the small apartment of recent Soviet immigrants, Jewish immigrants who immigrated to South Bend, Indiana, where we lived at the time. My family instilled in us an appreciation of tikkun olam, and that commitment has never wavered. Even in retirement, my parents remained committed to service, whether Meals on Wheels, serving on community boards, mentorship of entrepreneurs, and tzedakah. Their examples have had a lasting impact on me as I strive to help our community through my own civic involvement. Brett and I hope to impress upon our children the importance of tikkun olam, mitzvahs, and sharing and giving, because we're Jewish and we're a part of this. A wise man once said, "Hope is that thing inside us that insists, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that something better awaits us if we have the courage to reach for it, to work for it, and to fight for it." In many ways, I think this quote embodies how I feel about my Judaism. Ours is a story of perseverance and optimism, that if we keep moving forward, working hard, fighting for justice, that a better world awaits our children and our children's children and beyond. While I may experience a dissonance between my religiousness and my Jewishness, I'm consistently finding myself supporting the role of Judaism in my children's lives. They're at the JCC preschool. They attend religious school here at Beth-El. They read the 4 questions during Seder. They love apples dipped in honey on Rosh Hashanah. And we hope to send them to Jewish sleepaway camp. One day, our children will learn our family's history. They will grow up celebrating the Jewish holidays. They will understand the importance of Tikkun Olam. In short, they will understand that they are Jewish and they are a part of this. I want to thank Rabbi Yergin for the opportunity to so meaningfully reflect on Judaism and its impact on my life. It has provided clarity, comfort, and most importantly, optimism.
acronym. I'm going to apologize. I am not a public speaker by nature. My name is Samantha Wohler. My family have been members here at Temple Beth-El off and on since the 80s when my dad was stationed at Fort Sam Houston. During the years we lived in Texas, Temple was a big part of our lives. My older brother David and I participated in Sunday school and Hebrew classes. Rabbi Stahl officiated my brother's bar mitzvah. My mom helped sell bagels before Sunday school and participated in the adult ed classes. For a period of a few years, it felt like we pretty much lived here. It was a really big part of our identity. Back then, being Jewish meant having this really cool and different experience from all of our friends. It was getting bonus holidays and extra days off school. But it was also being unique and special and having this whole set of other friends and people who shared the same traditions we did, and we could all come together and celebrate. In middle school, we transferred to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. We lived in one of the suburbs of Kansas City, and for the most part, my being Jewish wasn't really a thing. Through my junior year of high school, I was aware of exactly 3 Jewish families in our school of 2,000 students. I can't say I had much of a community to embrace. So we practiced some of our traditions at home, and on the high holidays, we sometimes sought out services at the local congregation. But it wasn't exactly a great fit for my family, and as a result, we weren't very active. I never had a bat mitzvah. We didn't go to Sunday school. No more involvement, really, with that community. So for those of you who don't know, Kansas City in the 90s was home to headquarters of several white nationalist and Aryan youth movements. And while living in Kansas City, there were several incidents of graffiti at the local synagogue, at the Holocaust Memorial, and on my locker at school. Some of the Aryan youth movements would literally show up on my high school campus passing out flyers and trying to recruit members. Suddenly, being Jewish was different, and not in a good way. As an awkward teenager and the new kid in a relatively tight community, I just wanted to fit in, and being Jewish made me stand out. I never really hid my religion, but I didn't exactly flaunt it either. Then, in 9th grade, my grandmother came to live with my family. It was only then that I started to learn some of her story. Sure, I'd heard bits and pieces of it throughout the years, but I think this was the first time that not only was I old enough to really sit still and listen, but to really understand what she was saying. According to my mom, it was also the first time my grandmother ever really shared her story. And it inspired a fascination within me. My grandmother's family was from Austria. She was born in 1915, and they had moved to Belgium shortly before her birth. They bought their way to the United States sometime in the early 1930s. And while Hitler did not become chancellor until the late 1930s, by 1921, the Nazi Party in Europe had formed and was quickly growing, influencing and reinvigorating anti-Semitism in much of Europe. I'd always been fascinated by history, particularly World War II and the Holocaust. And when I say fascinated, understand that I mean in a really horrific way of how in the world did that actually happen. But hearing the stories from my grandmother firsthand, she lost her entire extended family. Her parents were the only ones who fled. She left behind cousins, aunts, uncles, friends to be murdered. And that sparked something in me. So teenagers, they rebel, right? They drink or smoke, listen to loud music, do other things that we're not going to talk about in Temple. Me, I became Jewish again. And with almost this fierce desire to live that out loud. Pretty good form of rebellion, right? My junior year of high school marked the 50th anniversary of the founding of Israel. That year, my theater department put on productions of both The Diary of Anne Frank and Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which opened on May 14th, the anniversary of Israel's founding. Now, as I said, there were 3 students that I was aware of in my high school that were Jewish, and we were all very involved in our theater. That opening night of Joseph, our theater director brought our cast and crew together to really acknowledge the significance of opening that play on that night. If you're not familiar with the play, you should see it. It's cute, it's campy, it's a lot of fun, and it's very loosely, based on Abraham and the 12 tribes of Israel. But Act 1 closes with a song that the main character Joseph sings while he's falsely imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. And the song is called Close Every Door to Me. And it hints at a lot of the anti-Semitism that has remained throughout history. It's hauntingly beautiful, and it culminates with the lines, "Children of Israel are never alone, for we know we shall find our own peace of mind, for we have been promised a land of our own." So after our director reflected on that play, specifically that song, on its significance and its ties to the creation of Israel so many years later, you could have heard a pin drop in that auditorium, despite a cast and crew of nearly 100 high school students, most of whom were not Jewish. I can't tell you the thoughts of my friends at that moment. There was reverence, it was contemplative, there was some enlightenment, but for me, it was a turning point. I realized I had found my place. I was accepted. I could be me, and being me meant embracing my Judaism, not hiding it. From then on, I moved through life unabashedly Jewish. I wore my Jewish star with pride, even through the police academy. I may or may not have a tattoo of the Hebrew word tekvah, which means hope. My son and I have been engaged, as engaged as we can with Temple, and I'm so proud that he embraces his Judaism and that he loves that it makes him unique and special amongst his peers. And I marvel at his conviction at such a young age to correct not only his peers, but also his teachers and other adults when they speak Christian traditions as global truths. Today, I still live my Judaism out loud. I have chosen to stand, to fight for people, for Jewish people and others still to this day when their rights are being trampled. I have been both embraced and ostracized because of this. I have had many a debate with colleagues and neighbors and even friends that consisted of me reminding them that as a religious minority in this country, things that seem obviously okay to them, things like prayer in schools, swearing testimony on a Bible, or saying prayer at our shift's roll call, those are far from okay for me, and are in many cases a total disregard of First Amendment rights. And while I fight, I acknowledge the perils and take what precautions I can to keep my family safe. In recent years, I, like many others, have ensured that my passport remains valid, just in case. And I've established a plan for my family if we were ever forced into hiding, just in case. I am fiercely protective of my son's image being used on social media, both because I'm former law enforcement and because I couldn't hide being Jewish if my life depended on it. My name, my picture, you can Google it, they're everywhere. His is not. But as I fight, and as I acknowledge the dangers that this world faces, I cling to the word that I chose as a permanent reminder for myself, tekvah, hope.
May we all stare hate head on and flex our Jewish muscles. May we all find our home at Temple Beth-El and be proud of our Judaism in San Antonio. May we all make memories of our own, allowing us to be connected to generations of Jews. May we all create a Jewish home in our own ways, allowing for change over the years. May we find a connection to Tikkun Olam, fulfilling it in various ways. May our Jewishness be a matter of pride, and may we find encouragement to be Jewish in all places and with many people. May we never forget and be inspired by our Jewish identity to make the world a better place. May we not be afraid of being Jewish and stand up to anti-Semitism. May we never forget hope, and may we know that we are never alone. Gemar Chatima Tova. See you at the afternoon service at 2:30.